Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Stephen. First thing to say is I'm not sure I've ever done a presentation when I'm this wet before, so forgive me if I look a bit damp. Okay, so what you see on the slide here, the title of this presentation is the title that I was given, if you like, my exam question, as I like to call it. As discussed with Nicholas and colleagues, I myself have not done any synthetic population modelling. I have colleagues at ITF Leeds, Institute for Transport Studies Leeds, who have done that. They've been doing that for many years, and we have been developing as well more recently with all the new data that's coming online, some very interesting techniques in spatial analytics, and I have been getting sort of involved in that. I also have a broader interest and expertise in mobility patterns, journey patterning, and how that those patterns segment among the population. Market segmentation is one of the techniques that I use, and I've been known to say that I can segment anything. So I apply segmentation to whether it's behavioural indicators and data that we have, whether it's attitudinal and motivational, and increasingly spatial data. So understanding how different locations, which may ostensibly appear to be quite similar in terms of density, built environment, demographic characteristics, actually behave, or the people in them, behave and respond to policies in different ways, and trying to understand why that might be, what the specific characteristics of the population, maybe sort of culturally, social and normatively even, you know, really quite soft things often that might explain why different locations respond differently. So that's sort of my context on sort of me, and you'll get elements of that as we go through. Like I say, this was the exam question. Actually, as Phil and I went through this, Phil being Phil Goodwin, some of you may know, is an economist, has worked very much with the theory, much of the theory that we were speaking of yesterday. So I needed him. I needed him to be my person that I could sort of ground the other things that I was talking about. And together we really started we felt we had to think more conceptually around what it would mean to think about the social distributional impacts of a congestion charge. And so some of the paper is almost a bit of a think piece to go through the conceptual and methodological issues and challenges here, as well as getting into a little bit of detail about the methods. So we ended up coming up with this, you know, we like to think it's going to take off, NODE as we call it, Net Overall Distributive Impact Assessment of Congestion Charge, and hopefully it'll come clear why we came up with that. So the objectives, if you like, that we came out with for the paper was to try and think through these new conceptual and methodological insights into thinking about defining distributive impacts, and measuring them, and then could they, well, I mean, even if you did that, in a way I'm giving away a sort of headline conclusion here of the paper, even if you have all the sophisticated data and ways of really quite detailing on a fine spatial scale and socially what the differential impacts might be across the population, how could you then operationalise that in policy? Are there instruments that could really help, or could you have unintended consequences? So to get there, we have to think about those data challenges and methodological challenges. I'm going to leave it to the discussion to think about the political challenges, because we seemed to do that quite well yesterday. I start with a quotation from Alan Walters back in the 1960s, economist, did a lot of important thinking about, well, charges in general around transport, but also congestion charging. And the words there highlighted in red are, I think, a good starting point, and I'm going to come back to it. So I'm going to do this presentation, and then I'm going to put this quote back up, and I'm going to ask you to see whether you've just reinforced whether you agree with this or not. But I just think that's a really interesting quote, and I think I have to say that perhaps if I'm honest, my reflection on yesterday would be that that's kind of where we were yesterday. Might be a bit unfair, but I'm going to put that out there. Now, it's also a bit unfair on Mons, but of course he came up with the phrase, well, it wasn't your phrase initially. I must take this slide out because I haven't put the true author of the quotation down here. But the best is the enemy of the good. And so as I say, as we think through this, we do have to think about the practicalities and the realities, and I am fully aware of that. But again, yesterday, I would say that we focused as well as we would in any case when thinking about a charging scheme on the classical case. There's good reason to do the modelling in this way, but the classical case has focused on congestion. So the classical case around road user charging has focused on congestion, hence we call it congestion charging an awful lot, and we focused a lot on congestion yesterday as well. There are other policy objectives, other outcomes we might go for, and other outcomes that we might, or wider disbenefits that we may want to avoid as well. So I sort of feel quite cautious about keep focusing on congestion and congestion charging. But again, that's just posing a question to you at this point. But I think the really interesting thing about the classical case, quite frankly, is that effectively it thinks that distributional impacts are quite boring. Or it thinks that distributional impacts are unnecessary to look at in any detail because effectively the winners and the gainers will be exactly compensated by each other at sort of the aggregate scale or at the scale of the community level. And I do think that's quite interesting because if that's then becomes a political decision, if you want to take that and that be the way in which you deal with distributive impacts, then you can do that. But we're here to discuss whether or not there's other ways of doing it. And also in practice, there are challenges to that classical case. So as we know, there aren't many of these schemes around, and the debate has come up and gone away and come up and gone away for decades, and still may continue to do so, even in the current kind of context of things around the revenue squeeze that we've heard about yesterday. But putting these charges in the context of the relative benefits of other modes, not just congestion, not just building roads to alleviate congestion, but having other ways of alleviating that congestion, does lead then to a need for a broader assessment of who wins and who loses. Also, the range of problems, as I say, goes beyond congestion. In London, just as we heard yesterday, the issues of congestion and air quality have come together very directly in a new structure of charging in the capital. And public acceptability, although it differs in different places, different contexts, and over time, before, after, etc., has also been an issue. And if you read the Daily Mail, infamous paper in the UK, then you'd be no doubt about the weight that can be attached and attached to assumptions around who wins and who loses, with the problem that often the policymakers can't come back with good data to counter those arguments because the assumptions are, so I'll give you an example, that there's big backlash with the press at the moment around this, what's called the toxicity charge in London that's just been introduced, to suggest that poorer people will be impacted because they drive the most polluting cars. Well, actually in the UK, poorer people tend to drive smaller petrol cars rather than larger diesel cars, and it's the larger diesel cars that are actually caught by the toxicity charge. So the press have actually got that wrong, and in that case, maybe the politicians can come back a bit on that, but it's that kind of detail that's required to be able to push back. I'm just going to go through these quickly because, of course, depending on the really big question is what is decided to be done with the revenue from a congestion charge. That's what really is going to determine the first order impacts and then impacts dynamically beyond that point. So as a very rough typology, here are 4 different options, ways in which the revenue could be used. So the revenue could be returned in the form of a reduction of other road taxes and charges. It could be spent on increasing road capacity. It could be spent on increasing other modes or improving other modes, and it could be put back into the general taxation pot. And I'm sure there are other options. As I say, just go through these quickly because just to sort of concentrate on the mind on all these different variants and different implications broadly for impacts. So with the returning the revenue through a reduction in other charges, road users as a whole may be collectively compensated. There may be a reduction in congestion on the congested streets, given that that's what the policy would be targeted at, and thus benefiting both those road users and the local residents. And the rural users who may not even use those congested roads may actually benefit as well through the reduction in their overall motoring costs. But there's not necessarily any direct match between the individuals who pay the road charge and benefit from that. That in this form, there would be no additional revenue to spend on other modes. What about spending on additional road capacity? Well, some additional benefit to the road users paying the charge, assuming it works. Particular gain to those car-owning residents in the non-urban areas who drive into the congested areas on the new roads now. But the induced demand through the freeing up of road capacity could lead to additional emissions in urban areas and could impact on public transport services if the road capacity new road capacity isn't benefiting them. And reduced congestion would reduce the revenue from the charges. So dynamically, if there isn't induced traffic and congestion it actually works, then there could be reduced revenue and needing to increase the charge. Spending the revenue on alternative modes. Well, urban drivers might benefit from reduced congestion and emissions, although we heard different views on that yesterday, depending on just how much extra capacity is needed and used, and whether it interferes with the other with cars on the roads and actually increases congestion. Those who changed modes would benefit from better health. Those who didn't drive would benefit, who didn't drive in the first place, would benefit from better environment and travel conditions. But urban motorists would be benefited to a lesser value than the charge paid on average. And motorists on the congested roads would be the ones paying more for everything else. So those who win and those who lose would be different again. And then finally, putting the revenue into general taxation. Well, the main beneficiaries might be different groups entirely to the ones who pay the charge. And that might be okay, might not be okay, but with a general reduction in taxation. But in this case, the drivers who pay the charge may not be happier, although if it works, congestion is reduced, maybe it would. But these are the sorts of questions. Okay, so we came to the idea that with all those different configurations and as I go on, you'll see all the different types of impact that you may want to consider. We came up with this concept of node, the net overall distributional effect. Because to do that assessment involves understanding who pays and who receives the revenues collected, who receives the benefits of the reduced congestion, who receives the benefits of any consequential improvements. That may be improvements to alternative modes, but also wider benefits of reduced emissions and quality of life and better living environment. But also how the impacts change over time, and that's incredibly tricky, but it's if you really want to do a net impact assessment, that's what you would have to think about as well. And of course, that net impact will itself differ, depending on a differential impact across different segments of the population. Okay, so getting on to now the methodologies that we've used. So broadly, the challenge is to say just looking at who pays and who doesn't pay isn't enough. The burden of the charge, so actually even sort of looking at who does pay, the burden of the charge is not determined only by the ability to pay in income terms, but also by the patterns of the journeys that those people make and their capacity to adapt and change should they need to or want to. That's kind of the building blocks upon which to do something like this, and both of those things are in themselves challenging. Right, I'm now going to get on to the actual modelling work. As I say, I was sort of asked to think about synthetic populations and microsimulation because ITS has a history of doing that. And one of the key papers is, as I'll talk about in a minute, from Peter Bonsall and Charlotte Kelly at ITS, and I'll talk a little bit about that with the caveat it wasn't my work, okay? So, but generally speaking, microsimulation involves generating a population of individuals that are simulated by because they correspond to the overall characteristics of any given locality that you're looking at. So it's generating a synthetic population that mimics the real population. And it's done by cloning data from often household surveys which themselves are done often quite not necessarily comprehensively, although census data often is. But the idea is often to merge different data sets to be able to get a really rich set of characteristics that you can profile your population on. With respect to modelling congestion charging, then you can map that. You have a spatially disaggregated profiling of your population, and you can then model various variants of a charge spatially and in terms of the way in which you're charging, time of day, etc., and assess the benefits from there. So Bonsall and Kelly did this, looking at a congestion charge, or 6 different variants of a congestion charge in Leeds, in the UK. So Leeds is where I am. At the moment, it's about 800,000 people. About 10% of those are students. We have a big student population. And I think it's about 70%, 65-70% drive to work by car in the morning peak. So I don't know if you can really get a sense of a place by those three little statistics, but anyway, that's Leeds. Okay, so they did this by generating a synthetic population, mainly from the UK census, but also using other data sets that we have, not quite as comprehensive as the census in terms of the coverage of the population, but household expenditure surveys, travel surveys, etc., to really understand travel patterning related to different socio-demographic characteristics. And that data was then itself linked to a traffic assignment package to understand the real spatial patterning over the course of a day and a city of those people from those different locations in Leeds. And then modelling how they would respond to these 6 different charging regimes. And they were specifically setting out, the authors, to look at what they called at-risk groups. And they defined those at-risk groups because not long before they did this work, there was some very important work done in the UK on social exclusion, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, really identifying what is social exclusion, what are the characteristics, again, not just income-based, but around ability to spend that income, around looking at single-parent households, different employment types, disabilities, etc. And the paper goes through that, and there's a nice summary of that, and defines what they determined to be the at-risk groups. And then they go through the analysis and they talk about, well, okay, so you can do this analysis, but even once you do, you've then got to decide, well, what's important to you? Is it absolute numbers of at-risk people that are affected by the charge? Is it the proportion of people affected who are at risk? It's a different metric. And in any case, what does at risk mean? There are different sort of extents to which people are actually impacted. So even once you have the data, you have another set of decisions. Again, it's a nice table sort of comparing some of these metrics in the paper. Then you can use the modelling to go through, okay, so one way of alleviating those risks is to perhaps exempt people. But one of the things that was found for Leeds, and of course this is going to be different in different places, were that actually the distribution of these at-risk people was very dispersed. So it wasn't possible it really wasn't going to work, was the conclusion, by drawing the boundaries differently. The only real way was going to be to try and exempt different groups, and they go through some of the modelling of that. And perhaps not, and what they also do is not just look at exempting, but also different types of policy, like improving public transport in certain areas and this kind of thing. So it's a very interesting piece of analysis, which I apologise for giving you a superficial overview of, but the paper's available, and I would recommend reading it. But as I say, as with any of these sort of statistical techniques, and then as new data comes online, the techniques develop, and there has been a lot of innovation around microsimulation. A good set of authors, also from Leeds, Mark Birkin and colleagues, have done some of the world experts in microsimulation. I've pulled out one quote from their paper because it helps to justify the data that I then am going to show you next. So they say, well, really, if we really want to do this sort of work because we want a spatially intelligent model, then we need spatially intelligent data. And the problem is that a lot of the household surveys that are used aren't. We're not able to disaggregate at a fine enough spatial level to really be able to develop a synthetic population at that scale. So what I'm about to show you is some data that I've been working with for all kinds of reasons, looking at all kinds of things, actually not congestion charging. I've looked at motoring costs in general, so big caveat there. But that I truly believe is the sort of data which I know is available also in New Zealand that could potentially help here. So this data, the project was called the MOT project. The data is a combination of the data generated when vehicles are registered. So obviously when a car is first registered, it's all got all the car characteristics and the owner. In our case, we have differentiation between private and business owners, and it has the location of that registered keeper. And every time a car changes hands, that gets a data field, another data point against that car. Then we also have data that's generated every single year, or at least from a car's third birthday, I should say, through the annual roadworthiness test. The most important variable that's generated from that, for our purposes, is the odometer reading that then allows you to generate annual mileages and assign them to each vehicle in the data set. So in the UK, there are almost 30 million light goods vehicles on the road. So this generates year plus year plus year plus year, and a huge data set. And although I say the data is available, I have had conversations with people here. There are security issues around it, and we had to sign our life away and work within a data secure environment and things to be able to use it. And it's also very messy data, but anyway, once you've got it and you've generated it, you've got a very valuable data set. So there you have every single vehicle in the country, to where it's registered, to where it's kept. Problems with that as well, but let's just stick with it for the moment. And because you have a locational tag for each vehicle, You can then use any other area-based data sets, the characteristics of the areas, and put that together and create area-based tables which has a very fine understanding of the vehicle fleet, its age, its characteristics, and its usage. And then you can combine that with other travel data and all kinds of built environment data and socioeconomic data, which is what we did. In combination, in parallel, we've had a project being undertaken by Dr. Giulio Mattioli at Leeds, looking at car-related economic stress. And what he has done is developed the issues around transport poverty, so to really understand what it means to be vulnerable to increases in motoring charges. And this is then, I mean, it's a bit more sophisticated than this, but one of the nuts and bolts concepts here is that it's around the proportion of income that is spent on motoring that can be really lead to what we call, often gets called precarity, where people are in a very precarious position if they find themselves subjected to increases in costs. And I've put some details on the slides here which actually aren't in the paper of the website, where all kinds of things can be downloaded. The picture you see there is just a very nice policy brief. It's meant to be digestible, easily digestible, that gives the initial flavour, and then you can go from there if you want to read more. So in combination with that project and the MOT project, we developed a spatial vulnerability index, and we were testing this against increases in fuel prices in England. And the index was made up of 3 different components. So the first one was exposure to increases in costs, and that was looking at the ratio of the amount people spend on motoring in relation to their income, their median income, so a ratio. The other one was income itself, and the other component was adaptive capacity, for which we used the UK accessibility statistics. Now they are, broadly speaking, they are, you can develop a composite index, accessibility index, based on the time it takes to get to key services by walking and cycling and public transport in the UK, and that data is updated and freely available. So they're the 3. They were standardised, and they were brought together into one vulnerability index. And this is what it looks like when it's mapped. So this is the standardized variable, and for those of you who don't know, this type of mapping here, which looks weird, we often call it the strangled chicken, is a cartogram, which is a different perspective. It's based more on the population in different areas rather than the land area. So, but in both maps, you'll see that the red is dominant. So the red is vulnerability, and that's not surprising, given that even though in a lot of rural areas in the UK income is higher, red actually, those areas have lower accessibility. So that's why. What's sort of surprising on the map is the big greater London area that is blue, which is low vulnerability. So in London, in the sort of suburban areas, well, not so much, but there are some real pockets of low income around London. But what you actually have here, of course, to compensate for that is high accessibility. Now, one of the things we're going on to do with this index is to bring in housing costs on top of it as well, because that could radically change this map, particularly around London. But the other thing to say is that kind of blueness around the metropolitan areas is not prevalent in our other large cities in the country so much, so indicating greater pockets of poverty, but also lower accessibility. Then we can, I'm not going to go through these in detail, but we can look at this at a very fine spatial scale then. And we've been doing this with different cities, and they've been looking at it in relation to what they understand about their cities. It's very important to get the real local knowledge and to see whether the metrics that we come out with really make sense. You can see that these are our four, pretty much our four largest conurbations, and they have very different patterns as a result of a combination of all the three things. What this doesn't show, and what the big map didn't show when you zoom in, is where some of the really vulnerable places are in the interurban corridors between our mainly our market towns and cities where there's a lot of commuting that goes on. Okay, so that was that work. Again, a bit of a trot through, a bit more detail in the paper. Then just very quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, the MOT data, as I described, we're doing all kinds of things with it, and I'm very excited about it. But the very practical use in the last couple of months has been working with Edinburgh City Council, who, like many other town cities in the UK, are going to have to introduce some form of low emission zone, which may or may not involve charging. And so Edinburgh are busy planning their zone at the moment, and the little yellow blob there is the zone that they're planning. Oh, I'm sorry, I've got these in the wrong order. There we go. Oh no, okay, so what I wanted to say was, So that's Edinburgh. On a wider scale in the UK with the MOT data, one of the things we've done is, broadly speaking, use the vehicle data to calculate for each vehicle a total NOx emission and all kinds of other things, but NOx emissions figure based on the fuel type, the vintage, the make and model of the car, but also the number of miles they do. So this is not just a vehicle-based NOx factor, but a total NOx produced as a result of how much driving this car does. And we've mapped, the two maps that you're seeing here are, if you like, the polluters versus the polluted. On your left, the sort of red-dominated map, this is saying that the most polluting people live in those red areas, mainly outside the towns. But as we know, the polluted zones, the concentrations of NOx, the measured concentrations on the ground, it's almost sort of reverse image. And that, that can be quite politically difficult to think about that. So we're able. We're experimenting with all kinds of different ways of calculating the NOx, and this is actually not the good stuff. This isn't the real world data yet. We've got some ways we're going to do that. So actually it could be worse than this, if you see what I mean. Yeah, it will be. Yeah. So that was just context to say, so we can calculate emissions figures in that way. Going back to Edinburgh, we can then use Edinburgh's the spatial mapping of this specific to Edinburgh to understand where the cars reside that are doing the most NOx, and we can couple that with the Edinburgh model, traffic model, which looks at the origins and destinations to understand the composition of the vehicles that are travelling through the proposed low emission zone and where they live, if you like, where those cars reside. And that gives a slightly different perspective, again, on who's going to be paying the charge, who's going to benefit from the charge, and also whether or not there may be different ways of doing it and not targeting it through a low emission zone, but actually somehow locally some kind of parking tax back in the places where these cars are actually residing. For instance, it starts to change the thinking. Okay, so here's my conclusions. And I conclude just with a couple of slides on what this all might mean for methodologically. Net impacts. can't just look at the instance of payments, need to look at the net impacts of the charges and the patterns, the benefits, maybe disbenefits arriving from how the revenue is spent. And it's not just about sort of progressivity or regressivity in relation to income, but about capacity to change, about the burden, the cost burden, the proportion of income potentially, and if we could get even better figures around sort of disposable income, which may be related to housing costs as well. The net impacts, I haven't talked about this very much because it's too difficult, will change over time depending on the behavioural response. So this issue of, you know, the first order impacts may be one thing, but there may be a whole different set of benefits or disbenefits. Some of those benefits may arrive because people have a longer time to adapt, so we need to think about that time scale. But it does add uncertainty to the model, and I would be interested in sort of hearing about, you know, developments in modelling that can take it, that can try and, I mean, it's always going to be uncertain, but can maybe kind of at least examine some of this uncertainty explicitly in the modelling to start with. Impact is related to adaptive capacity, as I've said, and I think this is quite relevant in terms of some of the things that we were talking about yesterday, or sort of conceptually, that adaptive response is not necessarily an indicator of gain or loss. So just because somebody does change or doesn't change doesn't mean they've benefited or disbenefited. So you may charge car users and the impact of that charge, even the reduction in congestion, may not be in proportion to how much the cars were used before the charge, because they have different opportunities to adapt. That as I say, we have used accessibility indicators to look at that capacity to change. I could be very critical of those as well, I'm afraid. I think, you know, somebody has said to me this week how wonderful the UK accessibility data is. I'm sure it's a good start. But these accessibility indicators, as many others, assess the quantity of access to services and not the quality, and still don't have necessarily, well, they don't have a handle on household variability to that, to be able to adapt. And then finally, the identification of gainers and losers demands a complex pattern of joint distributions by economic, social, travel and geographical variables. So income's not the best way to identify gainers and losers. The journey patterns are incredibly important to understand this. And the benefits may then also be falling upon people with a completely different income profile. As I've said, those that benefit in the UK's case from lower emissions may actually be really quite low income, and that may be a good thing. Okay, so then I come back to my final question, which I will leave sitting. Well, no, I won't actually. Something else quickly I just want to do. But yeah, so there I started with this, and I've trotted through some issues. I haven't solved anything, I know. So I don't think I'll explicitly ask you for a vote, but you can be left to ponder whether or not you actually agree with this statement after all. And then just very quickly, finally, when Joanne was putting her presentation up yesterday with the framework, I didn't have time to do this. I'll blame the alcohol. I thought what I wanted to do, my aspiration, was to take some of these questions and actually answer those in light of the sorts of analysis and thinking that Phil and I have done, which I didn't manage to do. But I thought if it's okay, just I'd leave these questions up again, because we didn't have too much discussion on them yesterday, and we could maybe talk about things in that light. Okay. Thank you very much.